It was early November when I got called out to the old highway that ran along the edge of town. The air had that sharp cold that comes just before winter, and a thin layer of frost covered everything, the ground, the power lines, even the grass in the ditches. It was just after midnight, and the roads were empty except for the occasional truck hauling through. I'd been sitting in my cruiser outside a closed gas station when dispatch radioed in about an abandoned vehicle found out near mile marker 42. No one had reported an accident, no calls for help, just a car left on the shoulder with its hazards flashing. That stretch of highway was quiet, mostly surrounded by open farmland and patches of woods. Not a lot of people used it at night. I didn't think much of it, but I started the engine and headed out. The drive took about 15 minutes. The night was clear and cold, the stars sharp against the sky. The only sound was the hum of the tires on asphalt and the faint rattle of my gear in the back seat. I spotted the car from a distance. The hazard lights blinked weakly in the dark, orange flashes bouncing off the road and the nearby trees. I pulled up behind it and parked. It was an older SUV, dark green, looked like it had been sitting there a while. The exhaust pipe was cold, no smoke coming out. I turned on my spotlight and aimed it at the driver's side window. The glass was fogged from the inside. When I stepped out, the air hit me like ice. My boots crunched on the frosted pavement. I could see the driver's door was open just a few inches, not wide, but enough to show it hadn't been closed properly. I called in the plate number and waited a moment, then walked closer. The door creaked when I opened it fully. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Stale air mixed with gasoline and something faintly sour, like old food. The interior light flickered on. The driver's seat was empty, but there was a jacket tossed across the console, a half-eaten sandwich on the dashboard, and a cell phone on the passenger seat. The engine key was still in the ignition. I leaned in and checked the phone. It was dead. In the back seat, I noticed a few things scattered around. A thermos, a pair of muddy boots, and a folded map. There was also a dark stain on the floor mat that didn't look like dirt. It wasn't a lot, but enough to make me uneasy. I shined my flashlight around and stepped back to look at the ground. That's when I saw the footprints, one set leading away from the car toward the tree line. The prints were clear in the frost, spaced unevenly like the person had been walking quickly or limping. I radioed in that I was following possible tracks and started along the path. The beam from my flashlight bounced off the frozen grass. The trees stood in a tight line ahead, black against the faint light from the sky. Once I entered the woods, the sound of the highway disappeared almost completely. It was quiet except for the crunch of frost under my boots. The footprints led deeper in, winding through the trees. A few branches were broken, and I could see scuff marks where someone had slipped or stumbled. About 50 yards in, I came to a small clearing. The ground there was uneven, and a small stream cut through the middle. On the far side, I saw something glint in the light, metal. I stepped closer and found an old cooler half submerged in the mud. It was cracked open, and inside were several empty bottles and food wrappers. Nothing strange, except it looked like someone had been there recently. The footprints continued beyond the clearing, following the stream. I kept going slower now. The air felt heavier, and the deeper I went, the more I could smell something faint, something metallic that didn't belong to the woods. My flashlight caught on something ahead, a shape on the ground, dark against the frost. When I got closer, I realized it was a backpack. It was torn open, contents scattered. Some clothes, a flashlight with a dead battery, and a small notebook. The pages were damp, the ink running. I flipped through it carefully. There were a few notes about fishing spots and trails, nothing out of the ordinary. The last page had a date from the day before, and a line that said, "Camp near the bridge, return in the morning." There was no bridge anywhere near where I was. The nearest one was another mile north, so I guessed that's where the person had been heading. I followed the prints again. The ground started to slope upward, and I could hear water moving faster ahead. The smell got stronger, like rust and wet soil. When I reached the top of the small ridge, I saw it, the old bridge that crossed the narrow river. It hadn't been used in years. The wooden planks were warped, railings rusted and bent. The footprints led right up to it, then stopped halfway across. The boards were slick with frost, and I could see scrape marks near the edge. I leaned over and shined my light down. The beam caught the water below, dark and moving fast, and there, half submerged near a tangle of branches, was a shape. Took me a second to realize what I was looking at. It was a man's body, tangled in the roots near the bank. I climbed down carefully, using the rocks and branches to steady myself. The current was cold and fast, but shallow near the edge. I grabbed the body and pulled it closer to the shore. The face was pale, the eyes open but empty. The man was wearing a plaid shirt and jeans, both soaked and muddy. His hands were cut and raw, like he'd been grabbing at rocks or trying to climb. There was no sign of anyone else around. I checked for ID. His wallet was still in his back pocket, soaked but intact. The name matched the car registration. Daniel Moore, 41 years old, local address. I called it in, gave the location, and waited for backup. The water moved quietly beside me, carrying bits of leaves and sticks downstream. When the others arrived, we pulled the body out fully and started going over the area. The footprints, the car, the scattered belongings, it looked like he'd gotten lost or maybe slipped trying to cross. But the scene didn't sit right. The torn backpack, the deep scrapes on his hands, and the fact that he'd left his car running with the door open. It all suggested he'd been running from something. We searched the woods for hours. No other footprints besides his. No sign of another vehicle. The autopsy later confirmed he hadn't drowned. He died from blunt force trauma to the head before ending up in the river. They found dirt under his fingernails and splinters from the bridge planks, like he'd been struggling. A week later, during the full investigation, we learned Daniel had been camping alone. His wife said he liked to fish the small creeks near that highway. He'd gone out 2 days before he was found and hadn't come back. She said he'd mentioned seeing someone camping near the old quarry a few times over the summer. Said it made him uneasy, but he never filed a report. We went back to search the area again, this time near the quarry a mile from the bridge. What we found there explained everything. In the woods near an old service road, there was a makeshift camp, a small tent, a rusted folding chair, and a pile of empty food cans. Inside the tent, there were several items that didn't belong to one person. Multiple driver's licenses, wallets, and even a few pieces of jewelry. The names on the IDs were from nearby counties. Some of those people had been reported missing over the last few years. The footprints around the camp matched a large pair of boots, heavier than Daniel's. There was also a blood-stained tarp buried shallowly behind the tent. Whoever had been living there had been watching that area for a long time. The most chilling part was that the camp looked freshly abandoned. The fire pit still had warm ashes. Whoever was there had been gone only a few hours. We never caught him. The area was searched for weeks, drones, dogs, everything. No sign. The trail disappeared past the ridge, and no one ever saw anyone matching the description of that unknown camper. They closed the case as a homicide, but with no suspect, it eventually faded like most do. The reports, the evidence, it all sat in a file somewhere. But that night stayed with me. The car with its hazards flashing in the dark, the single set of footprints, the torn backpack, the quiet sound of water under the bridge. It all plays back in my mind sometimes, especially when I drive alone at night on empty roads. What bothered me most wasn't what we found. It was what we didn't. Someone had been out there, close enough to watch him, close enough to move unseen in those woods. And when we showed up, they just vanished into the trees like they'd never been there at all. That's what scares me even now. Not the dark, not the bodies, not the quiet woods, but knowing that some people learn how to live just outside the light. Long enough to watch, long enough to wait, and then gone before you ever know they were there. It was late October, and the night shift always had a certain weight to it that time of year. The days were shorter, the air sharper, and the town felt emptier after dark. I'd been on the force for 11 years, long enough to get used to the usual trouble, bar fights, drunk drivers, domestic calls, but every once in a while, something came along that didn't fit any pattern. That night started quiet, too quiet, which in my experience usually meant something was coming. I was patrolling the back roads on the west side of town. It was an old farming area, full of decaying barns and long-forgotten houses swallowed up by weeds. Most of the farms had been abandoned when the economy fell apart years ago. I knew the area well, too well, honestly. The radio had been silent for almost an hour when dispatch broke in with a call about a possible break-in at one of those properties. A neighbor had reported seeing lights moving around in a house that had been empty for over a decade. That wasn't unusual on its own. Teenagers like to mess around out there, sneaking into old buildings or daring each other to spend a night inside. Still, it was my job to check it out. I made a U-turn and headed down County Road 9. The old asphalt cracked and lined with frost. The temperature had dropped fast after sundown, and the mist rising off the fields looked like smoke drifting low to the ground. The house in question sat at the end of a gravel road about a mile off the main route. The property had once been large, a barn, a tool shed, and a 2-story farmhouse. But now it was just a collapsed roofline and a mess of vines. I slowed the cruiser as I pulled in. My headlights swept over the yard, catching the pale shape of the house. The windows were all broken, the porch half caved in, the front door hanging crooked on one hinge. I parked and cut the engine. The silence after the car shut off was heavy. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling metal and the wind pushing through the tall grass. I stepped out, my boots crunching on gravel, and immediately saw it. A faint glow moving inside the house. Not a flashlight beam, more like the dim flicker of a lantern or candlelight. It shifted slowly, then disappeared behind a wall. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up the path. The air smelled like mold and old wood. The grass was waist-high in some places, hiding rusted debris and broken boards. The porch groaned when I stepped on it. I paused for a moment, scanning the windows. Nothing, just darkness again. I went inside through the front door. The floorboards creaked under me, and the smell hit hard: dust, dampness, and something faintly sour, like rotting fabric or animal droppings. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, showing peeling wallpaper, collapsed furniture, and piles of leaves blown in through the broken windows. The light I'd seen earlier was gone. I swept the room slowly, moving toward the back where the kitchen used to be. There were footprints in the dust, fresh ones. They were small, maybe size 8 or 9, not old or worn like boots. I followed them through the doorway into what had once been the dining area. The tracks led to the basement door, which was half open. I hesitated. I've been in plenty of basements in my life. Some cluttered, some flooded, some that looked like they hadn't seen sunlight in a century. But this one had a kind of stillness that put me on edge. The footprints went right down the stairs, straight through the dust that had settled thick over everything else. I stepped carefully, keeping my flashlight low. The wooden steps were soft underfoot, some broken clean through. The beam hit the floor at the bottom and picked out something metallic. An old generator. Maybe. The air down there was damp and cold. When I reached the bottom, I saw what had been giving off the light earlier. A small oil lantern sat on top of a crate, still burning weakly. It looked like someone had been here not long ago. Around it were a few strange things: an old sleeping bag, some canned food, a plastic jug of water, and piles of clothing stacked in the corner. The clothes didn't look like one person's either. Some men's, some women's, different sizes and colors. I checked the floor for more footprints and saw several overlapping each other, as if more than one person had been staying down there at different times. I felt my stomach tighten. The thought that someone might be living in this house wasn't unusual, but the way it looked, organized but wrong, made me uneasy. There was a smell too, stronger near the back wall. Not rot exactly, but something old and metallic. My flashlight caught a dark stain on the concrete that had soaked in deep. I followed it with the beam, and it led to a large chest freezer pushed up against the wall. It wasn't plugged in, the cord cut short. The top was secured with 2 rusted latches. I didn't want to open it, but I had to. I unclipped the latches, feeling the cold metal against my gloves, and lifted the lid. The smell that came out was thick and heavy. Inside were several plastic garbage bags tied shut. I poked one gently with my flashlight handle, and it gave slightly under the pressure, soft, uneven, not solid. I cut one open with my knife, and what I saw made my chest go cold. Inside were bones, human bones, mixed with old fabric and bits of rope. Some were clean, others stained dark. It didn't look fresh, but it was deliberate. Someone had been collecting them. I stepped back and scanned the rest of the basement. On one wall, there were dozens of old photographs pinned up, faded Polaroids, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn maps. Most of the photos were of wooded areas, empty roads, and old buildings, but a few showed people, faces half-turned, blurry, like they'd been taken without permission. At that point, I knew this wasn't some squatter or drifter. Whoever had been living there had been watching people for a long time. I radioed for backup and waited. I didn't move far from the stairs, keeping the basement in sight. But as I stood there, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small tunnel dug into the dirt wall behind the freezer. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. The edges were lined with boards, and a faint draft came from inside. I aimed my flashlight into it, but the beam didn't reach far enough to see the end. The dirt floor was smoothed out, almost like someone had used it regularly. I didn't hear anything, no movement, but something about that tunnel felt alive, like the air was moving through it from somewhere deeper underground. When backup finally arrived, we cleared the property inch by inch. The tunnel ran about 20 yards before opening into another small underground room, a sort of makeshift den. Inside were more piles of belongings, old blankets, canned food, and more photographs. It looked like whoever lived there had been hiding out for months, maybe years, but there was no sign of the person themselves. No footprints leaving the tunnel, no trail through the grass outside, nothing, like they'd vanished the moment we arrived. For weeks after that, the investigation continued. The bones were identified as belonging to 3 missing people, all from nearby towns, all gone within the last 5 years. The timelines matched the years the house had been abandoned. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no neighbors who'd seen anyone come or go. Eventually, the case went cold. We sealed off the property and posted it as condemned. But sometimes, on night patrol, I still drive by that stretch of road. The grass has grown higher now, the porch has completely collapsed, and the windows are gone. Still, I swear I've seen a faint light flicker through the trees more than once. I don't stop anymore. I don't go near that house, because whoever was living there, whoever built that tunnel, kept those photos, and filled that freezer, they were smart. They knew the woods better than anyone, knew when to disappear. And if they survived out there this long, I doubt they went far. The house was torn down 2 years later after another complaint about strange noises coming from the property. When the demolition crew finished, they found another tunnel under the foundation, this one running under the field and ending in a small drainage pipe that emptied near the creek, almost half a mile away. That explained how they'd vanished without a trace. The bones, the tunnels, the photographs, they told a story I still think about when I'm out late and the roads are empty. Some people don't need ghosts or monsters to be frightening. Some are just patient, quiet, and perfectly hidden in the places the rest of us stopped looking. It was a little after 2 a.m. when I got the call. I had been sitting in my cruiser parked off the highway, the kind of quiet night where even the radio static feels louder than usual. The dispatcher said there'd been a 911 hang-up call from an address way out on Old Pine Road. No one answered when they tried to call back. That road was barely used anymore, just a long stretch of cracked asphalt running through empty farmland, with only a handful of houses still standing. Most of the people who used to live there had moved away years ago. Usually, a hang-up call at that hour meant one of 2 things: a drunk dial or a domestic that went bad. I started the engine, took a sip of cold coffee, and headed out that way. The drive took maybe 15 minutes, but it felt longer. The fog was heavy that night, thick enough that the headlights only cut about 30 feet ahead. The trees lining the road leaned inward, their bare branches arching overhead like they were closing in. The address was listed as 418 Old Pine. I remembered the place from years ago, an old ranch-style house set back from the road with a detached garage and a long gravel driveway. The guy who owned it had died, and it had been sitting empty ever since. At least that's what I thought. When I turned down the drive, my tires crunching over the gravel, I saw faint light coming from one of the front windows. It wasn't bright, more like the soft yellow of a candle or a weak lamp. I parked in front of the house, leaving the cruiser lights off so I wouldn't blind myself in the fog. The air was cold, and the silence was the kind that pressed in from every direction. No wind, no insects, not even the sound of distant traffic. Just me and the quiet. I stepped out, flashlight in hand, and started toward the house. The grass along the walkway was overgrown and slick with dew. The siding was peeling, the roof sagging, and the windows were coated with grime. I noticed the front door was slightly open, just enough to see the dark gap inside. That's when I felt that low, heavy feeling in my gut, the one that tells you something's not right before your mind even figures out why. I pushed the door open slowly. The smell hit immediately. Stale air, mildew, and something else underneath, faint but sour, like old meat or rotting garbage. My flashlight beam swept across the living room. The furniture was covered with dusty sheets, and the floor was littered with old magazines, beer cans, and bits of broken glass. It didn't look like anyone had lived there properly in a long time, but someone had been inside recently. There were muddy footprints near the doorway, barefoot, small, and spaced oddly apart, like whoever made them had been moving slowly, dragging their feet. The prints led through the living room toward the hallway at the back. I followed them, careful with each step, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The hallway was narrow and darker than the rest of the house. My flashlight caught the edges of several open doors, one leading to a bedroom, another to a bathroom, and one that seemed to go down to the basement. The footprints went toward that one. The door to the basement was shut tight, but I could see dirt and dust disturbed around it, like it had been opened recently. I reached for the handle, but the second I touched it, I heard a faint sound from below. It wasn't movement exactly. It was rhythmic, slow, uneven thuds, like someone was dragging something across concrete. Then silence again. I waited, listening, the beam of my light shaking slightly in my hand. I could feel my pulse in my ears. When I finally pulled the door open, a wave of cold, damp air came up. The steps were steep and narrow, covered in dust except for a single path cleared down the middle. I started down slowly, testing each step. The smell got stronger the further I went. It was unmistakable now, decay. At the bottom, the flashlight caught the outline of a workbench, some broken tools, and an old washing machine. Then the light hit something else. Plastic sheeting covering what looked like a pile of bags in the corner. I walked closer, trying to keep my breathing steady. There were at least 6 black garbage bags tied up tight, all different sizes. One of them was torn open near the top, and something pale stuck out from the rip. It didn't take long to realize it was bone. Not animal either. The shape of the joint, the clean edge, it was human. My throat went dry. I stepped back, scanning the room again. Against the far wall was a mattress, filthy and damp, with blankets piled on top. Next to it sat several glass jars filled with what looked like murky liquid and floating bits of something unrecognizable. There was also a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, still faintly warm, meaning it had been on recently. Whoever had been here wasn't gone for long. The dragging noise came again, faint but closer this time. My light shot toward the sound. It came from the far side of the room, behind an old freezer tipped on its side. I moved closer, keeping my back to the stairs, and saw another door I hadn't noticed before. It was smaller, metal, maybe a storm hatch leading to another section of the basement. There were fresh scuff marks on the concrete near it, and streaks that looked like something heavy had been pulled across the floor. I backed toward the stairs, deciding to wait for backup before opening that door. But as I started up, I noticed something on the steps. Fresh dirt. Small clumps of wet soil scattered up to the landing. Not there when I'd first come down. My flashlight beam followed the trail back down, across the floor, and straight to that metal door. It wasn't closed anymore. It was slightly ajar. The dragging sound stopped. Then came a soft scraping noise, like fingernails or metal brushing against the concrete floor. I stood completely still, every muscle locked, waiting for movement. Nothing happened, just that sound of air moving through the cracks, cold and steady. I climbed the stairs carefully, one hand gripping the rail, flashlight still pointed behind me. When I reached the top, I shut the basement door and secured it with my shoulder, my pulse hammering so hard it made my vision pulse. I called it in for backup, gave the address, and waited outside by my cruiser, eyes locked on the front of that house. When the others finally arrived and we went back in, the basement was empty. The mattress was gone. The bags, the jars, everything. Only the old tools and the broken washing machine were left. Even the footprints I'd seen earlier were gone, like the dust had been brushed over. We checked every inch of that place, even dug around outside near the foundation. Nothing. No one. No sign of who had made that 911 call or what I'd seen. But that smell never left the basement. It was faint, soaked into the walls, impossible to scrub out. A week later, another hang-up came in from the same number, same address. This time when we traced it, the line was dead, completely disconnected, not even active anymore. The phone inside the house had been removed years earlier. I don't know who called that night, or who lived down there under the floor for who knows how long. But something had been there. Someone had used that place to hide, and they knew the land well enough to vanish without leaving a trail. Months later, the property was sold to a developer. The house was demolished, the lot cleared. When the foundation was torn out, workers found a sealed storm shelter buried under the back corner of the basement. Inside were piles of clothes, bones, and dozens of small jars filled with preserved human tissue. The official report said they were from different people, none ever identified. I went back once just to see the cleared land. It was strange standing there, the open field quiet again, no house, no basement, no smell. But even then, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints leading into the dark. It made me realize something I'd never forgotten since. Sometimes the worst things we find aren't crimes of passion or quick violence. Sometimes they're built slowly, hidden in places we drive past every day, waiting for someone to open the wrong door. That 911 call never made sense. But whoever made it might have been the one who didn't get out in time. And the person who did, well, they were out there somewhere. Still are, probably. And every time I get a hang-up call on a dead road or an old property, I remember that smell, those footprints, and the way that basement door eased open like it was waiting for me all along. It was around 3:40 in the morning when I got the call. I'd been parked behind the old gas station at the edge of town, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour earlier. The night had been dead quiet. No traffic, no noise, no movement. Just the low hum of the cruiser and the steady tick of the clock on the dash. Then the radio cracked with a report from dispatch, a possible abandoned vehicle along County Road 47. A man on his way to work said it was parked half in a ditch with the headlights still on. At that hour, anything could be waiting in a car like that. Drunk driver, overdose, someone sleeping it off, or something worse. I put the cruiser in gear and headed that way. The air outside was cold enough to fog up the windshield, and frost had started to gather at the edges of the glass. The road out there was narrow and lined with thick woods. I'd driven it hundreds of times before, and it always felt darker than most places. Like the trees soaked up every bit of light. Took about 15 minutes to get there. When I rounded a bend near mile marker 12, I saw it immediately. A white sedan tilted slightly off the shoulder, front tires sunk halfway into soft dirt. The headlights were still on, pointing into the trees. The driver's side door was open. I pulled up about 20 feet behind it and left my cruiser lights flashing. The fog was thin but moving fast, and the cold made everything feel sharper. I stepped out, hand on my flashlight, and started toward the car. The ground was soft under my boots, and the sound of gravel crunching felt too loud in the quiet. The car's engine wasn't running, but the lights drained the battery slow, giving off a dim yellow glow that flickered at the edges. I leaned in slightly to look inside. The front seat was empty, so was the passenger side. There was an open wallet on the dashboard, a half-drunk bottle of water in the cup holder, and a phone on the passenger seat with the screen cracked. What caught my eye first, though, was the mud on the floor mat. Fresh, thick streaks of it smeared across both sides like whoever had been in there had climbed in with soaked shoes. I looked closer. There was something else. Small pieces of pine needles stuck in the carpet, and the faint smell of wet earth, stronger than it should have been for just one person walking through the woods. I checked the back seat, empty except for a few plastic bags and a jacket. The keys were still in the ignition. I noted the license plate and took a step back. The fog had thickened while I'd been looking inside. It hung low over the trees now, blurring everything past a few yards. I noticed something strange near the back of the car. In the mud just off the shoulder, a set of footprints led away from the vehicle toward the woods. Barefoot, deep impressions. Not big, maybe a man's size 9, but spread wide apart like whoever made them had been running or stumbling. The edges of the prints were still sharp, not yet filled in by dew. That meant they were recent, maybe within an hour. I followed them slowly, my flashlight beam bouncing over the uneven ground. The first few steps were clear, then the tracks grew lighter as they hit the patch of grass before the treeline. The fog swallowed everything past that. I radioed in the situation and moved forward another few feet. The forest ahead was pitch black, no moonlight breaking through the branches. The smell of wet pine was heavy. The ground was slick, covered in leaves that made a soft, wet sound under each step. About 20 yards in, I found something else. A torn shirt caught on a low branch. It was damp and dark with something that looked like old blood, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. I took a closer look and noticed a few scratches on the bark below it, like fingernail marks or something dragged past in a hurry. I kept moving deeper. My breath was visible in front of me, slow and steady. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No animals, no wind, not even the sound of branches shifting. Just that low hum you get when everything's waiting for something to happen. The footprints continued but started to scatter. At one point, I saw two sets for a few steps, one deeper, one lighter, then they merged again. I couldn't tell if it was an illusion from the fog or if someone had been following the first person. After about 50 yards, I reached a clearing. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small parking lot, but it was completely bare, nothing growing in the center. The ground was disturbed. The soil turned up in uneven patches like someone had dug or struggled there. My flashlight caught something shiny half buried in the dirt. I crouched down and brushed the dirt away. It was a metal bracelet, bent and scratched. Not far from it was a single sock, torn at the heel. There were no footprints leaving the clearing, just a mess of disturbed soil that stopped abruptly near a shallow depression, maybe 6 feet across. At first, I thought it was a sinkhole or an animal burrow, but when I stepped closer, I saw straight edges cut into the earth, like someone had dug deliberately and then filled it back in. The soil was fresh, dark and damp, smoother than the ground around it. I stood there for a long moment trying to piece it together. A car left running lights on, footprints leading into the woods, a torn shirt, a disturbed clearing, and a fresh mound of earth. Everything about it felt wrong but real, too ordinary to dismiss, too strange to ignore. I marked the spot and called for backup. It took nearly 30 minutes for another unit to arrive. By the time they got there, the fog had thickened again, heavy enough that we could barely see each other's flashlights. We went over the clearing, took photos, flagged the site. Eventually, we called in a team to dig. The mound was shallow, no more than 3 feet deep. Inside was the body of a man. No ID, no wallet, no shoes. He had bruises along his arms and neck, and his face was swollen. The coroner later said he'd been dead less than 4 hours when we found him. But that wasn't the strangest part. When we ran the plates on the car, they came back registered to a man who matched the dead one's description. Same clothes, same watch, same haircut. The only thing missing was the shoes. The pathologist found something odd in the man's hands. Soil and pine needles mixed with small fragments of skin that weren't his. They took samples, ran DNA, and matched them to another man who'd gone missing 3 weeks before. That man had also been last seen driving through the same area, just a few miles up the road. For months after that, I couldn't shake the image of that clearing. The way the earth looked freshly disturbed, how the prints vanished halfway through the woods, like the man had walked himself into the ground. The investigation never found who did it. They said it could have been a drifter, someone picking off travelers, or maybe two people who met under bad circumstances. There were no tools left behind, no extra prints, nothing solid to trace. I went back once on my own, a few weeks after the case went cold. The car was gone, the clearing marked off by tape that had already started to peel in the weather. The mound had sunk slightly, the dirt compacted by rain. But what got to me most was that, just beyond it, maybe 10 feet away, there was another depression in the ground, smaller, less even, like something had started to dig there and stopped. I walked back to the cruiser in silence. The trees looked the same, the fog just as thick, but something in that place felt alive, like it was waiting for another car to stop, another set of lights to cut through the mist. That night, when I got home, I cleaned the mud off my boots and found pine needles stuck in the tread. I threw them out, but it didn't change much. Every time I work nights now, I think about that car, those barefoot tracks, and that fresh mound of dirt in the middle of the clearing. People talk about evil like it's some big thing, something obvious, loud, dramatic. But it's not. It's quiet. It's careful. It's someone who knows exactly how deep to dig and exactly when to disappear. And when you find it, there's no noise, no answers. Just a car on the side of the road with its headlights still on and the fog moving through the trees, covering everything back up like nothing ever happened. I'd been a police officer for a little over 15 years when I got the call that changed the way I thought about quiet places. It was late March, cold rain coming down steady, the kind that made everything look gray and washed out. My shift had been slow, mostly welfare checks and traffic stops. Around 9 that night, dispatch sent a call about an abandoned car found near an old service road by the river. It was a dark stretch of road that didn't lead anywhere except to an old quarry that had been shut down years ago. A local fisherman had seen the car there earlier that morning, still running with the driver's door open. When he passed again at sunset, it was still sitting there, lights off now, door still open. He thought something didn't look right and finally called it in. When I got there, the rain had turned to a mist, and my headlights cut through a wall of fog that had rolled up from the river. The car sat about 20 yards off the road, angled toward the trees. I pulled up behind it, parked, and stepped out. The air was damp and heavy, and the smell of wet earth and pine hit me right away. The ground sucked at my boots with every step. The car was an older model silver sedan, engine off, driver's door open wide. The keys were still in the ignition, and the interior light glowed faintly, throwing a weak yellow light over the empty front seats. There was no one inside. The radio was off, but the windshield wipers had stopped mid-swipe, stuck halfway up the glass. I shined my flashlight across the inside. There was a half-empty coffee cup in the holder, a wallet on the passenger seat, and a phone wedged between the seats. The wallet belonged to a man named Kevin Morales, 32, from a nearby town. No criminal record, nothing that stood out. The car didn't look stolen. When I stepped around to the back, I noticed muddy footprints on the ground. They led away from the car toward the woods that ran along the riverbank. The prints were uneven and deep in spots, like whoever made them had been moving fast or stumbling. I radioed my location, reported what I saw, and started following the tracks. The trees grew close together almost immediately, and the light from the road faded behind me. My flashlight beam bounced off wet trunks and glistening undergrowth. The mud was thick and slippery, and the prints led deeper and deeper into the woods. The sound of the river was faint at first, but grew louder the farther I went. After maybe 100 yards, I found a small clearing. There were tire ruts in the mud from some kind of off-road vehicle and a rusted metal drum lying on its side. The footprints circled near the drum, then continued toward the water. I followed them until the ground turned rocky and the mud gave way to wet sand. The river ran dark and fast there, swollen from the rain. That's where I found the first sign of trouble. Near the edge of the water, there was a torn piece of fabric caught on a branch. Looked like part of a flannel shirt. A few feet away, I saw drag marks leading from the waterline up toward the trees. The marks weren't clean. They were messy, scattered, as if someone had tried to get away or was pulled halfway before letting go. I moved my light slowly along the ground. The mud showed impressions of hands and knees, then more footprints, 2 sets now. One looked like the ones I'd been following, about a men's size 10. The other set was larger, heavier, deeper in the mud, as if made by boots. It was clear now that Kevin hadn't been alone out here. I followed the prints for another 50 yards until they disappeared near an old storage shed that must have belonged to the quarry years ago. It was half collapsed, roof sagging, door hanging off one hinge. I could smell something faint as I got closer, something metallic and sour that cut through the rain and mud. Inside, the shed was dark except for the weak beam from my flashlight. The floor was covered in old debris, broken boards, and rusted tools. In one corner, I saw a dark stain on the concrete that looked fresh despite the damp. There was also a small pile of what looked like clothing and a torn backpack. I checked the bag and found an ID inside. It was Kevin's. There were also a few personal things: a flashlight with dead batteries, an empty energy drink can, and a small folding knife, still clean. Behind the shed, the footprints picked up again, leading uphill toward a ridge. I climbed slowly, every step sinking in the wet soil. The trees thinned out at the top, and I could see faint lights through the mist. Looked like an old cabin or shack tucked between the trees. No power lines ran out here, so I figured it was running off a generator. The lights inside flickered slightly, and the faint hum of machinery reached my ears. I stayed low, moving quietly. The front door was closed, but there was a window cracked open just enough to see through. I wiped the fog from the glass with my sleeve and looked inside. There was a single room, small and cluttered. The walls were lined with old tools, ropes, buckets, and what looked like hunting gear. A table stood in the middle with several objects laid out in a neat row: metal hooks, wire cutters, a roll of duct tape. I couldn't see anyone, but I noticed muddy footprints on the floor leading to a back door that was slightly open. When I moved closer to that door, I saw something lying on the ground behind the cabin. A tarp, soaked and heavy. I lifted the corner with my flashlight. Underneath was a man's body, face down in the mud. It was Kevin. His clothes were soaked, and there were deep bruises around his wrists and neck. It didn't look like a fall or an accident. I radioed it in, gave my position, and waited for backup. The rain started coming down harder again, cold and relentless. I stayed near the body, scanning the woods around me. I didn't see anyone, but I could hear faint noises, branches snapping somewhere farther off, maybe 50 or 60 yards away. Whoever had done this was still nearby. When backup finally arrived, we swept the area, but we didn't find anyone. The cabin was searched top to bottom, and what we found made it worse. There were 3 separate pairs of shoes, all different sizes, a few stained with dried mud. In the corner was a box of old photographs, shots of men standing near the river taken from a distance. Some looked recent, others older. None of them were Kevin. The tools, the ropes, the tarps, it all pointed to someone who'd been using that place for a long time. But there was no sign of who it was. No fingerprints, no ID, no food, no personal belongings except the photos and some old work clothes. The next day, daylight revealed even more. About 100 yards from the cabin, near the base of a large tree, we found a shallow pit filled with animal bones, and among them a few human ones. The medical examiner confirmed later they belonged to different people, all male, all gone missing within the past 5 years from towns along the river. Kevin had probably stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. Maybe he'd been fishing or hiking and saw movement near the shed or cabin. Maybe he followed the sound, thinking it was nothing. He didn't stand a chance once he got close. The case became one of the biggest manhunts we'd had in years, but no one was ever caught. Whoever used that cabin vanished completely, leaving behind only traces of what they'd done. The area was later sealed off, the structures torn down, and the land marked for cleanup. Sometimes I still drive that stretch of road, even though it's not on my patrol route anymore. The trees have grown back thick, and the path to the old quarry is almost invisible now. But every time I see fog rising off the river at night, I remember that flickering light from the cabin and how quiet everything was when I stood there alone with the body. It wasn't the kind of fear that came from shock or surprise. It was the kind that settles deep, the kind that stays with you because you realize how easily people can disappear. Kevin wasn't a criminal, not involved in anything strange. He was just a regular guy who went looking when he heard something in the woods. That's what scares me most about that night. The thought that it could have been anyone. One moment you're driving home in the rain, and the next you're gone, swallowed up by the kind of darkness that doesn't need monsters or ghosts, just a quiet place where no one's looking and no one's listening. Even now, when I think about it, I still see the footprints in the mud, that second set deeper and heavier, leading into the woods and never coming back out. It was late January when I got the call that still keeps me awake some nights. The cold had settled hard over the town that week, the kind of cold that makes your breath hang in the air and your hands ache even through gloves. I was on the night shift, working a route that covered a stretch of old highway and the outskirts of a small rural community. It was mostly quiet that time of year, just traffic stops, the occasional drunk driver, maybe a deer hit on the road. Nothing too serious. At around 2 in the morning, dispatch radioed in about a car parked along County Road 6. A man who drove a snowplow had seen it sitting there for 2 nights in a row. No movement, no one around. He thought maybe it was abandoned or broken down. Normally, that wouldn't be anything major, but it was parked about a mile past the last house on that stretch, and the temperature had been below freezing for days. I figured it was worth checking out, just to make sure no one was stranded or worse. The road was empty when I headed out there. My headlights cut through the cold fog that hung low across the fields. Every few minutes I'd pass a patch of frozen trees, their branches heavy with ice. The sound of the tires on the road was the only thing I could hear. When I finally spotted the car, it was pulled slightly off the shoulder, half covered in frost. It was an older model sedan, dark blue or maybe black. It was hard to tell under the layers of dirt and ice. The windows were fogged over, and there was no sign of lights or movement inside. I parked a few yards behind it, flipped on my hazard lights, and stepped out. The cold hit me immediately. My boots crunched on the frozen gravel as I walked toward it. I shone my flashlight inside through the driver's window. The seats were empty, no one in the back either. There was a thin layer of frost on the inside of the windshield, which meant it had been sitting there for a while. On the passenger seat, I saw a half-empty bottle of water and a crumpled fast food bag. The keys were still in the ignition, which was strange. I checked the license plate and called it in. The car came back registered to a man named Stephen Cobb, 38 years old, local address about 15 miles away. No outstanding warrants, nothing suspicious. I tried to see if there were footprints or tire marks nearby, but the snow had hardened, and the wind had covered up most of it. There were faint prints leading toward the woods that lined the side of the road, just beyond the ditch. That made my stomach tighten a little. People wander off for a lot of reasons, sometimes drunk, sometimes confused, sometimes because they don't plan to come back. I followed the prints to where the snow was deeper. They went past the ditch and into the trees. I called it in again, letting dispatch know I was going to check the area. The woods were dark and quiet. My flashlight beam caught the glitter of ice on the branches. The prints led straight for a while, then veered slightly to the right. I kept walking, careful not to slip on the uneven ground. After about 50 yards, I saw something on the ground, a piece of cloth frozen into the snow. It looked like a torn piece of jacket lining. A few feet ahead, I found a glove half buried. The prints were still visible, and I followed them deeper. The air felt heavier the farther I went. My breath echoed in the quiet. Then the tracks suddenly stopped near a small clearing. I swept my light around slowly. There was a shape in the snow near the base of a tree, a lump, half buried under frost and fallen branches. When I brushed the snow away, I found him. The man from the registration, Stephen Cobb. His face was pale and stiff, eyes open, staring up. He was wearing a thin jacket, jeans, and no gloves. His hands were cut and frozen. It looked like he'd been there a couple of days. There was no obvious wound or sign of struggle, but his expression was strained, like he'd been in pain before he went still. I checked for a pulse anyway, even though I knew. Nothing. I called it in, gave my coordinates, and waited. I stood there in the cold, listening to the faint creak of the trees. The ground around him was disturbed, like he'd been crawling before he collapsed. I followed the marks backward a few yards and found where he must have fallen the first time, near a patch of exposed dirt. There were scratch marks there, long grooves in the frozen ground, like he'd been trying to drag himself. When backup arrived, we went over the area together. No signs of another person. No blood. No weapon. The only thing we found was a small flashlight about 20 feet from his body. Its battery dead. He must have been using it before it went out. The coroner came later that morning and took him out. Hypothermia, most likely. They said his body temperature must have dropped too fast for him to recover once he got disoriented. But the question was, why had he left the car in the first place? It was still running when I checked it, meaning it must have run until the gas was gone. Maybe it stalled. Maybe he ran out of fuel. But then why walk into the woods instead of down the road where someone might find him? We got a warrant to search his house later that day. Inside, everything looked normal, neat, lived in, nothing unusual. But his phone was still on the kitchen counter, screen cracked. The last text he sent was 2 nights before the car was found. It was to his sister and just said he'd be checking something out and would call later. That call never came. When we went through the rest of the house, we found a small map pinned to the wall of his garage. It had a section of County Road 6 circled in red, right near where we found his car. There was a note written beside it. Heard noises. Maybe coyotes? Check tonight. That detail stuck with me. Locals sometimes reported animal sounds from those woods, but they were nothing new. Still, it was clear he'd gone there intentionally that night, maybe to see what the noise was. A few days later, after the case was closed as accidental hypothermia, I went back out there. I couldn't stop thinking about why he had crawled that far, or what he thought he was chasing. I parked near the same spot and walked out into the trees again. The snow was melting a little by then, but the path was still visible. The place felt different in the daylight, quiet, still, but heavy somehow. I followed the trail back to where we'd found him, then kept walking a little farther past that clearing. The ground dipped slightly, leading toward a narrow ditch filled with ice. On the other side, I noticed a rusted metal hatch in the ground, half covered by branches and snow. It looked like an old storm shelter or storage pit. I hadn't seen it before. The hatch was unlocked but heavy. I lifted it enough to shine my light inside. There were steps leading down into a small concrete space. The air coming out was cold and stale, and the walls were slick with frost. It looked abandoned, but there were things inside. A few plastic containers, some empty bottles, and a sleeping bag rolled out in the corner. Someone had been using it, probably a squatter. There were also bones on the floor. Small ones at first, animal bones maybe, but farther in there was something larger, a ribcage half buried under old rags. I didn't stay long after that. I called it in again and waited for backup. The shelter turned out to be an old storage bunker from the 1960s. It had been forgotten for decades. Inside, the forensic team later found evidence that someone had been living there during the past few months. There were bits of food, cigarette butts, even a few pages torn from a notebook with incoherent writing. Nothing that identified who it was. The bones were mostly animal, but a few were human, too old to match the man from the car. The coroner said they could have been there for years. There was no clear answer about who had used the shelter or how often, only that someone had been. That's what we think happened. Stephen must have heard strange noises near his property. Probably this person moving through the woods, and decided to check it out himself. He drove out there at night, maybe saw something that spooked him, maybe followed the sound too far into the trees. Then he got lost, his flashlight died, and the cold did the rest. No one was ever found living in that shelter, and no one came forward to claim it. We sealed it off after the investigation, filled it in with dirt and concrete. But sometimes, when I'm on patrol near that road, I think about how quiet it was that night, about the empty car, the frozen footprints, the open woods swallowing everything behind them. I've handled worse cases since then, but that one sticks in my mind because it felt so ordinary at first, just a parked car in the cold. It reminded me how easily people can vanish, not because of something dramatic, but because of a simple wrong turn, a moment of curiosity, or a single bad decision made in the dark. Stephen Cobb probably just wanted to see what was making noise out there. Maybe he thought it was nothing. Maybe he was right, but he never made it back to his car. And standing out there in the frost that night, I understood how thin the line is between routine and tragedy. It doesn't take monsters or legends, just a man, a dark road, and the kind of silence that makes you forget which way home is. I'd been on the force for 12 years when that call came in. It was late October, around 2 in the morning. The air outside was cool, almost damp, and the station was dead quiet. Most of the city slept at that hour. I was halfway through my shift, trying to keep myself awake with bad coffee, when dispatch called about a possible domestic disturbance on the outskirts of town. An isolated property off a back road that cut through old farmland and woods. The area was mostly empty except for a few rundown houses that hadn't been updated in decades. They said the neighbor called in after hearing yelling and what sounded like banging on metal. No one could get through to the house's phone. No previous complaints had ever come from that address, so I figured it was either a drunk argument or some kids fooling around. But I took the call anyway since I was the closest unit. The drive took about 20 minutes, winding down narrow 2-lane roads with no lights, just my headlights cutting through the dark. The deeper I went, the quieter everything got. No other cars, no dogs barking, just the hum of my engine and the gravel crunching under my tires. The GPS said I was close, but the mailbox was so faded I almost missed it. The driveway was long and overgrown, the kind that made you feel like you were trespassing just by turning onto it. I slowed down as my tires kicked up small rocks, scanning the tree line. The house finally came into view, a small single-story structure with a detached garage and a few old vehicles scattered around. No lights were on, no movement anywhere. I parked a few yards from the front porch and shut off the engine. The silence hit me like a weight. I could hear the creak of the car settling, my own breath, and nothing else. I radioed in my location and stepped out. My boots crunched on the gravel, and the cold air hit my face hard. The place looked neglected. Paint peeling, porch boards warped, a couple of broken windows covered with cardboard. The front door was cracked open just a few inches. That put me on edge right away. I called it in, then walked slowly toward it. The wood groaned under my weight. I could smell something faint but off, like iron and rot. My flashlight beam cut across the small living room. There was an old couch, a coffee table covered in empty beer cans, and clothes scattered everywhere. The place looked lived in but chaotic, like whoever was here hadn't cared about cleaning in a long time. There was a faint sound from somewhere inside, a soft metallic clink, irregular and slow. I froze for a second, holding my breath. The sound came again, maybe from the back of the house. I moved toward it carefully, scanning each doorway as I passed. The kitchen looked worse than the living room. Old dishes stacked high, a refrigerator door left open, flies buzzing inside. The sound was coming from behind a closed door near the end of the hall. I could see faint marks on the floor where something had been dragged. My heart was beating hard, but I kept steady. I eased the door open slowly. It was dark except for the light from my flashlight sweeping across the space. It was a laundry room. The washer lid was open, and beside it was a toolbox tipped on its side. Tools scattered across the floor. And then I saw it. Blood spattered along the wall near the washer, dark and dried. There was no one in sight. No body, no sign of movement. I stepped closer. The metallic smell hit stronger now. I crouched near the blood, shining my light lower. There were smudged footprints leading out the back door. Bare feet, small ones, maybe a woman's. They went out into the yard through a door that hung half open. I followed them out, the cold air biting harder. My light swept across tall grass and weeds. A few yards out, I saw something, a dark shape near a rusted-out shed. I moved toward it slowly, hand near my weapon, every sense wide awake. When I got close, I saw that it was a man lying face down in the dirt. No movement. His shirt was soaked in blood from a deep gash across his back. I checked for a pulse, but there was nothing. The body was cold. I looked around the property again, trying to piece it together. The footprints didn't stop near him. They kept going toward the woods. Small bare feet, dried blood trailing with them. Whoever it was had run off after this happened. The shed door was open too, and I went to check it before calling it in. Inside the shed, it was even worse. The air was thick and stale. There were chains hanging from a beam, a small table with knives laid out, and a camera tripod set up facing a chair that was stained dark. On the floor, there were ropes and duct tape. It wasn't hard to figure out what had gone on here. It wasn't just a fight. This place had been used for something bad, maybe for a long time. I stepped back out and radioed it all in. Dead body, possible victim fled on foot. Crime scene secured. Backup and crime scene techs were on the way, but they were a long drive out. I was told to stay put and wait. That's always the worst part. Standing there in the dark, knowing something ugly happened, and not knowing who else might still be nearby. I walked the perimeter again, trying to see if I'd missed anything. Near the tree line, I found more blood drops leading deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed them for a bit, just a few dozen yards. The trees closed in fast, branches scraping against my uniform. The ground was uneven and covered in leaves. I kept my flashlight low, following the faint red trail. Then I saw a torn piece of white fabric caught on a branch. It looked like a nightgown or dress. There was another sound then, something moving up ahead, quick but light. I froze again, scanning the dark. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something pale. A hand, maybe, slipping behind a tree. I called out, told them I was with the police, but there was no reply. Just the sound of someone running farther into the woods. I knew better than to chase too far alone. It was too easy to get lost or ambushed. I stopped at a fallen log, marked the location on my GPS, and headed back to the house. By the time backup arrived, the sun was just starting to lighten the sky a little. The whole property looked even worse in that dim gray light. Detectives showed up, the coroner, and later crime scene units. They bagged everything, took photos, and combed the woods for hours. The man turned out to be the homeowner, a 50-year-old named Mark Halley. His record was clean, but his basement wasn't. When they searched the house fully, they found another hidden door under a rug in the bedroom closet. It led to a narrow staircase that went down into a concrete room. Down there were more of the same: chains, old bloodstains, a pile of women's clothes, and several ID cards belonging to missing women from nearby counties. It was clear then what he'd been doing. The woman who escaped was one of them. They found her 2 days later about 6 miles away, hiding in a hunter's shack. She was half-starved, covered in bruises, but alive. She'd managed to hit him with a wrench during an argument and ran barefoot through the woods. She thought he was still chasing her when she heard my car coming up the driveway. She didn't stop running until she couldn't anymore. The case went public fast. People couldn't believe something like that had been happening right outside town. He'd lived there for years, quiet, kept to himself. No one had any idea. The evidence tied him to at least 4 missing persons cases. They said he filmed everything, but most of the tapes were destroyed before we got there. Took weeks for the smell of that house to leave my nose. The blood, the rot, the damp wood, it all stuck. Even months later, when I'd drive past that area for patrol, I'd feel it again. The silence, the empty house, the open door. They tore the place down eventually. The land's still empty now. Every time I think about it, I remember that quiet drive, the cracked front door, the sound of something faint and metallic behind it. I've seen plenty in this job. Accidents, suicides, murders, but that night stayed with me more than any of them. It wasn't just what happened there. It was how close it came to being missed. One more hour, one less call, and she might have been another body buried somewhere behind that shed. The thought of that still hits me sometimes when I'm sitting in my patrol car at night, engine idling, nothing but static on the radio. The woods are still out there, dark and endless, hiding whatever people want to keep unseen. That's the part they never tell you about being a cop. It's not always the chases or shootouts. It's the quiet drives to forgotten places, the smell of something wrong before you even see it, and the way the silence follows you long after you leave. It had been raining for most of that week, a steady drizzle that never really stopped, just thickened and thinned throughout the day. The kind of rain that made the streets shine under the streetlights and kept the air heavy with the smell of wet concrete. I was a patrol officer in a small Midwestern town, the kind of place that saw more noise complaints than real crime. Most nights were quiet, some drunk driver, a domestic argument, maybe a shoplifter. But that night stuck with me because it felt wrong before I even knew why. It was around 2 a.m. when dispatch sent me to check out a parked car off a service road near an old industrial site on the edge of town. It wasn't an unusual call. People sometimes pulled over there to sleep, get high, or hook up, but the location always gave me a strange feeling. The plant had closed down years ago, leaving behind a row of rusted fences, old storage buildings, and a cracked access road that looked forgotten. The rain had turned it into a slick mess of mud and puddles, and the area was surrounded by dark woods on 3 sides. As I drove down the narrow road, my headlights caught the shape of the car. An older silver sedan, engine off, lights off. The windows were fogged from the inside, and it looked like someone had been sitting there for a while. I parked behind it, left my cruiser lights on low, and stepped out. The rain was light now, just enough to tap against my jacket. The air smelled like rust and wet leaves. I approached the driver's side slowly, shining my flashlight through the glass. The first thing I noticed was that the driver's seat was empty. The passenger side was empty too. I moved my light around and saw something strange. The back seat was full of trash bags. Not normal trash either. The bags looked tied tight, stacked neatly, almost like they were packed for transport. There were at least 6 of them, large, black, and shiny from the damp air. I called in the plates, waited for dispatch to respond, and started checking the area around the car. No signs of anyone walking off recently. No fresh footprints in the mud. No flashlight beams in the woods. The rain had probably washed away anything older than an hour. The response from dispatch came back a few minutes later. The car was registered to a man named Henry Caldwell, a 37-year-old who lived about 30 miles away. No warrants, no alerts, just a regular citizen. Normally, I would have called for backup right then, but the town had only 2 cars out that night, and the other officer was on the far end of the county with a DUI arrest. I decided to have a quick look in the car. The driver's door was unlocked, which already made me uneasy. The interior smelled like damp fabric and something faintly metallic. When I opened one of the trash bags just a little, just enough to see what was inside, I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't garbage. It looked like clothes, but not folded. Torn, muddy, and stiff, as if they'd been wet for too long. I could see a piece of fabric that looked like denim, maybe jeans, and something that looked like a brown work boot, but smaller than an adult's. I closed the bag immediately and stepped back. My pulse picked up. I knew I couldn't assume anything yet. It could have been old donation clothes, maybe old uniforms, but something about the smell and the way they were packed felt wrong. I called it in, told dispatch I needed a detective and forensics out there. They said it'd take about 30 minutes. I was alone with that car, the rain, and the dark woods pressing in around me. While waiting, I walked a bit further down the access road, shining my light along the edges where the pavement broke into mud. About 20 yards from the car, I found a fresh set of tire marks that veered off into the trees. The ground was soft, and I could see deep impressions from where someone had backed up too fast or spun their wheels. The tracks disappeared into the woods. I followed them for a short distance before realizing they led to another vehicle, a dark pickup truck half hidden behind a thick patch of brush. The truck's headlights were off, but I could see that the driver's door was open. My first thought was that the person who owned the sedan might have transferred something between the 2 vehicles. I moved closer, careful where I stepped, my flashlight cutting through the misty air. Inside the truck, I saw an open toolbox on the passenger seat, a crowbar, and a roll of duct tape. On the ground next to the truck, there was a small, dark stain. Could have been oil, but the color was wrong. It looked too red. That's when I heard a noise. A branch cracking came from deeper in the woods, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I turned my light in that direction, but the beam caught only dripping branches and tangled brush. My hand rested on my holster automatically. I waited, listening. The rain masked everything, but after a few seconds, I heard another sound, soft footsteps moving away from me. I started following them, my boots sinking in the mud, the flashlight shaking slightly from my heartbeat. The forest wasn't thick, but it was dark, and the ground sloped down into a shallow ravine. The smell of wet earth was heavy, and somewhere close by, I could hear water running. A small creek, maybe. I moved slowly, scanning left and right, trying not to make noise. Then my light hit something pale on the ground. It was a hand. Took me a second to process it. The body was lying half covered by wet leaves, just a few feet from the edge of the ravine. Male, mid-40s maybe, face down, mud-soaked, no jacket. The back of his shirt was torn, and there was a dark wound near his shoulder. I checked for a pulse out of reflex, but he was cold. It looked like he'd been there for at least a few hours. I called it in immediately and stayed put, watching the woods, trying to listen for anything else. There was nothing. No movement, no voices, no other sounds except rain hitting the leaves. The detectives and forensics arrived about 40 minutes later. When they searched the area, they found a second body a short distance away, smaller, a teenager maybe. Both victims had similar injuries, blunt trauma and cuts. The sedan and the truck were towed. The bags in the car contained clothing, rope, gloves, and what appeared to be personal belongings of the victims. Everything pointed toward Henry Caldwell, the registered owner of the car. But by the time we checked his house later that morning, he was gone. The neighbors said he'd left late the previous evening with his truck loaded up. His phone was still on the counter. His wallet was missing. Over the next few days, the rain didn't stop, and the case unfolded piece by piece. Turns out the victims were two local men who had gone missing 3 nights earlier after leaving a bar just outside of town. Caldwell had worked there briefly as a janitor but was fired 2 months earlier. He had no criminal record, no history of violence. The truck in the woods was his too. He must have parked the sedan first, moved the bags, then tried to hide the second vehicle when he saw me coming down the road. He probably ran when he heard my cruiser. For almost 2 weeks, we searched for him. Every abandoned house, every shed, every mile of those woods. No trace. It wasn't until later, when a hunter found a body about 8 miles from where the cars had been, that the search ended. It was him. No gun, no note. Looked like he'd fallen or possibly taken his own life. No clear answer. I remember standing there, watching as they loaded his body onto the stretcher, the cold morning fog hanging in the air. The whole thing felt strange. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just heavy and silent. The woods were quiet again, as if they'd taken everything in and gone still. Sometimes I still drive past that old service road when I'm on patrol. The trees have grown thicker around it, and the old industrial lot has been fenced off. There's nothing left there now, no signs of what happened, no marks on the ground. But every time I see the reflection of my headlights in that spot where the sedan once sat, I feel the same uneasy stillness I felt that night. It wasn't the worst case I ever worked, but it was the one that stuck with me the longest. Not because of the bodies or the investigation, or even the man who did it. What stays with me is how quiet it was. The way the rain fell, the smell of wet earth, the sound of my own breathing in the dark. How close I must have been to him that night without realizing it. How he was probably watching me from the trees before slipping away forever. And how, for a few minutes, standing there beside those 2 cars, I felt like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next.